Why would a diner manager lock a waitress in a freezer over a red notebook? The question hung in the freezing air as Grace Holloway pressed both trembling hands against the steel door. Frost clung to the sleeve of her coffee-stained apron. A cracked name tag dug into her palm. Somewhere beneath 50-pound bags of frozen flour, hidden behind stacked boxes of hamburger patties, a small red tip log waited in the dark. Grace's lips had already turned blue, but she wasn't thinking about dying. She was thinking about making sure Ray Mercer never found that book. The cold had a sound. Most people didn't know that. They imagined silence. But silence inside an industrial freezer wasn't empty. Creaked, groaned, whispered through metal shelves and frozen pipes. Grace could hear all of it now. The hum of the compressor, the crackle of ice forming along the hinges, the slow weakening rhythm of her own breathing. She closed her eyes for a second and saw her mother's face. Not from today. Not from yesterday. From years ago. Don't let people make you ashamed of honest work. The memory hit harder than the cold. Her fingers tightened around the broken name tag. Then everything faded into white. 3 hours earlier, the diner sat beside Interstate 87 like it had been forgotten by time. Neon lights buzzed against the darkness. Truckers drank burnt coffee. Waitresses carried heavy trays beneath yellow lights that made everyone look tired. Grace moved through the room the way she always did. Quietly, carefully, trying not to take up too much space. She had learned that years ago. When you were a plus-sized woman who sometimes stumbled over words when nervous, people often decided who you were before you finished your first sentence. Grace means well. Ray Mercer loved saying that. He said it with a smile. That made it worse. Grace means well, he told a customer after she accidentally dropped a spoon. Grace means well, he told new employees when introducing her. Like she was a child. Like trying was the most impressive thing anyone could expect from her. Every time he said it, people smiled politely. Every time, something inside her shrank a little more. Tonight was different. Grace carried a tray loaded with coffee mugs toward table 7 when a customer stood abruptly and clipped her shoulder. Hot coffee splashed across the tray. A mug shattered against the floor. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Grace felt heat rise into her cheeks. Sorry, she started. Ray appeared instantly. Not angry, not loud, just smiling. It's okay, Grace, he said softly. You always do your best. Laughter rippled through the room. Not cruel laughter. Somehow that hurt more. Grace bent to collect the broken pieces. Nobody noticed her hand shaking. Nobody except the man sitting alone in the corner booth. Elias Moretti looked up from his untouched coffee. Just once. Long enough to see Grace slide something from beneath the register and tuck it into her apron pocket. A small red notebook. Then she returned to work. 20 minutes later, after the dinner rush slowed, Grace sat alone at the counter comparing tip entries. Numbers, times, signatures, tiny details nobody cared about. Except one detail refused to leave her alone. A delivery receipt stapled inside the back cover. The timestamp read 11:43 p.m. She stared at it. Then at the security monitor above the kitchen door. Then back at the receipt. Something wasn't right. Across the diner, Elias noticed her staring at the same piece of paper for nearly a minute. He wasn't interested in receipts. He wasn't interested in waitresses. Yet when Grace quietly slipped the receipt deeper into the notebook and looked over her shoulder as if afraid someone might see it, he found himself watching anyway. Because for the briefest moment, the fear in her eyes looked real. And when Ray Mercer walked past her station seconds later, his gaze didn't go to Grace. It went directly to the red notebook hidden beneath her hand. Ray Mercer smiled the way some people carried pocket knives. Polished, folded away, easy to miss until you felt the cut. His eyes lingered on the red notebook beneath Grace's hand for half a second before he continued toward the kitchen. Long night, he said casually. Don't stay too late. The bell above the diner door chimed. A truck driver stepped inside carrying cold air and road dust. Somewhere behind the swinging kitchen doors, the dishwasher rumbled like distant thunder. Life continued. Orders were called. Coffee poured. Plates clattered. Yet something had shifted. Grace felt it the same way people felt a storm before seeing clouds. She waited until Ray disappeared into the office before opening the notebook again. The receipt was still there. Delivery received. 11:43 p.m. Signed by R. Mercer. Her eyes drifted upward to the security monitor mounted above the pie display. The tiny black and white feed showed the loading dock behind the diner. Empty. Silent. Then she remembered something. Tuesday night. Then, she had taken out trash bags at exactly 10:56 p.m. because she'd missed the last sweep of table 12. The delivery truck had already been there. She remembered the white trailer. Remembered stepping around puddles near its rear tires. Remembered checking her phone because her mother had texted about a doctor appointment. Grace reached into her apron and pulled out an old phone with a cracked corner. The battery was barely alive. She scrolled back through messages until she found it. 10:58 p.m. Her mother's text sat there like a timestamp preserved in amber. The truck had been present 45 minutes before the receipt claimed it arrived. Her pulse quickened. Not proof. Not yet. But enough to make her uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Across the diner, Elias Moretti watched her study the phone. He didn't stare. Men like him never stared. They noticed. There was a difference. He lifted his coffee cup. Untouched for nearly an hour now. His gaze shifted toward the office window. Ray stood inside speaking on a cell phone. Calm. Smiling. Then Ray looked through the glass and saw Grace still holding the notebook. The smile vanished for a fraction of a second. It returned immediately. Too quickly. Elias filed that away. 10 minutes later, Grace carried fresh coffee to booth 6. When she returned, the notebook was gone. For one terrible second, her stomach dropped. Then she spotted it beside the register. Moved. Not stolen. Just moved. She knew she hadn't left it there. Her fingers tightened around the damp towel in her hand. Looking for something? Ray asked. He stood beside the pie case. Friendly as ever. My notebook. Ah. He nodded sympathetically. You really should be more careful with important things. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Did you move it? Ray chuckled softly. Why would I care about a waitress's notebook? Silence stretched between them. Not long. Not dramatic. Just long enough. Grace took the notebook back. The pages looked untouched. Almost untouched. Then she noticed a corner folded near the back. One page she never folded. Someone had been inside it. That much she knew. Ray's smile remained perfectly in place. You work too hard, Grace, he said. Sometimes people start seeing problems that aren't really there. Later, while wiping down an empty booth beneath flickering neon light, she opened the folded page and found something she had never written herself. A tiny grease pencil mark beside the receipt. A single number drawn in the margin. 11:43. Circled twice. The number seemed to stare back at her. 11:43. Circled twice. Grace sat alone in booth 9 after midnight. The red notebook opened beneath the glow of a failing pendant light. The diner had thinned out. Only 2 truckers remained near the windows, speaking in low voices over cold pie and colder coffee. The dishwasher rumbled somewhere beyond the kitchen doors. Every few seconds, the neon open sign buzzed and flickered red across the chrome napkin holders. Grace ran her thumb over the grease pencil mark. It wasn't hers. She never used grease pencils. Those belonged in the manager's office beside inventory sheets and freezer logs. Someone wanted her to see the number, or someone wanted her to be afraid of it. She reached into her apron and pulled out her old phone again. Cracked screen. 23% battery. She opened the photo she had taken months ago after a shift when her mother needed medication and every extra dollar mattered. The loading dock sat behind her in the image. A white delivery trailer. Timestamp. 10:58 p.m. The same trailer listed on the receipt. The same delivery supposedly arriving at 11:43. Grace swallowed hard. The difference wasn't a few minutes. It was 45. Too large. Too deliberate. She looked around instinctively. Nobody appeared interested in her. Yet she suddenly felt watched. The office blinds were half closed. Through the gap, Ray sat behind his desk. His head was lowered, his phone pressed to his ear. Then he looked up, directly at her. Grace lowered her eyes first. Not because she was guilty, because she knew what happened to people who challenged men who controlled paychecks. 10 minutes later, she found another inconsistency. It arrived disguised as something boring. An unpaid invoice shoved into a stack of vendor paperwork waiting for signatures. Most employees would never look twice. Grace always did. The paper listed a refrigeration maintenance company. Service completed at 12:17 a.m. She frowned. The diner had been closed for emergency freezer maintenance 3 weeks earlier. She remembered because everyone had complained about spoiled ice cream and melted pie filling. Yet, according to the invoice, repairs happened after midnight. On a night when she had personally locked the kitchen at 10:30. She remembered because she had missed the last bus and walked home in freezing rain. Memory wasn't perfect. She knew that. But suffering had taught her to remember details. People rarely believed her words. Details were safer. Working late. The voice startled her. Grace looked up. Elias Moretti stood beside the counter. Not imposing. Not loud. Just present. The kind of presence that made rooms adjust around it. Just paperwork, she said. The words almost caught in her throat. Elias glanced at the invoice, then at the receipt, then at the notebook. He didn't ask what she thought she had found. He didn't rescue her from her own doubts. Do you always keep records like this? His tone was neutral. Only when numbers don't make sense. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not belief. Not yet. Interest. And how often do numbers not make sense here? Before Grace could answer, Ray appeared. Almost instantly, as if he'd been listening. Grace worries too much, he said with an easy smile. That's one of her charms. He laughed softly. Nobody else did. For the first time, Grace noticed the pause. Before Ray's smile settled into place. The tiny strain around his mouth. The fraction of a second too slow. Elias noticed it too. Ray rested a hand lightly on the counter. You know how she is. She sees patterns in everything. Grace felt the familiar humiliation trying to crawl up her spine. The invitation to stay quiet. To become small. Instead, she looked at the invoice. Then why was freezer maintenance signed for on a night the building was already closed? Silence followed. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just heavy. Ray's smile remained. His eyes did not. Probably a paperwork error, he said. Those happen. Then he picked up the invoice before either of them could read it again. A simple movement. Casual. Almost forgettable. Except when he turned. A folded work schedule slipped halfway from beneath the papers in his hand. Grace only saw it for a second. Long enough to notice one impossible thing. Someone had altered her shift hours after the schedule had already been printed. Someone had altered her shift hours after the schedule had already been printed. Grace stared at the paper for less than a second before Ray folded it back beneath the invoice stack. Most people would have missed it. The change had been made in blue ink nearly identical to the original printing. One number. One tiny adjustment. Yet Grace knew the schedule by heart. She always did. When money was tight, hours mattered. When your mother's prescriptions depended on overtime, 30 minutes mattered. Ray smiled as if nothing unusual had happened. You should head home soon, he said. You've been working hard. The words sounded kind. The message underneath them did not. Grace watched him disappear into the office. Then she quietly wrote 2 times on a napkin. The original shift ending. The revised shift ending. 43 minutes apart. The same strange gap that kept appearing around receipts and paperwork. The next afternoon, the diner hosted a private luncheon in the upstairs dining room, a space rarely used except for wealthy clients and business meetings. Dark wood paneling, crystal water glasses, framed photographs of local politicians shaking hands with donors. Grace carried a tray of coffee up the staircase while trying not to think about the napkin folded inside her apron pocket. The room smelled expensive. leather briefcases, cologne, freshly pressed suits. People spoke softly because they expected to be heard. She had just placed a coffee service on the long table when a woman near the window glanced at her name tag. "Could we have someone else refill the coffee?" the woman asked. Her tone remained perfectly pleasant. "Nothing personal. She's just carrying quite a bit already." A few polite smiles appeared around the table. Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. Grace felt the familiar pressure behind her ribs, the invitation to become embarrassed on everyone's behalf. Instead, she adjusted the cracked name tag on her apron and continued pouring. Her hand never shook. "The coffee's fresh," she said quietly. "It won't spill." Silence followed. The woman looked away first. Across the room, Elias Moretti sat at the far end of the table reviewing documents. He didn't intervene. He didn't defend Grace. But he noticed something else. Every time Grace entered the room, Ray answered questions directed at her. Every single time. "Grace, when was the vendor delivery?" one board member asked casually. Ray responded before she could open her mouth. "Around midnight." Later, another guest asked about staffing records. Again, Ray answered for her. Grace carried plates, refilled glasses, watched. By the end of the luncheon, a pattern had emerged. The wealthy guests treated her like furniture. Ray treated her like a witness he couldn't quite stop watching. As people prepared to leave, Grace passed the service station outside the dining room and saw a folder partially exposed beneath a stack of menus. Payroll records. She shouldn't have looked. But one page caught her eye. The employee listed at the top was Miguel Santos, the dishwasher fired for allegedly stealing tips. According to the record, Miguel had signed a disciplinary statement 3 weeks ago. Grace froze. She knew Miguel's signature. She'd helped him fill out insurance forms after he injured his wrist. The signature on the payroll document wasn't even close. "Everything okay?" Ray's voice appeared. Behind her. Smooth. Calm. Grace closed the folder carefully. "Just checking table counts." Ray smiled. "Good. Details matter." For a moment neither moved. Then he stepped aside and let her pass. The gesture looked courteous. Somehow it felt like a warning. An hour later, after everyone had gone, Elias remained alone at the long table. One sheet of paper rested beside his untouched coffee. A guest seating chart from the luncheon. Someone had written delivery notes on the back. Most people would have ignored them. Elias didn't, because beside one vendor entry, in the exact same blue ink used to alter Grace's schedule, someone had written a time he now recognized immediately. 11:43. The number followed him home. 11:43. Written in blue ink on a seating chart. Written in blue ink on a revised schedule. Written in blue ink beside a delivery entry that should have been ordinary. Elias Moretti sat alone in the back booth long after the diner closed, a cup of coffee cooling untouched beside his hand. The staff had gone home. The neon sign painted the windows red. Across the room, Grace was wiping down the last counter. Neither of them spoke. Silence settled between them like a third person at the table. Then Grace did something unexpected. She crossed the diner carrying the red notebook. Not nervously, not dramatically, deliberately. She stopped beside his booth and placed something on the table. An old flip phone. The plastic casing was scratched. One corner was held together with clear tape. "What's this?" Elias asked. "Proof," Grace said quietly. "Maybe." She opened the phone herself. Not because she trusted him, because she didn't trust anyone else. The phone belonged to Miguel Santos, the dishwasher who had been fired. Most people barely remembered him now. Grace did. She remembered the wrist injury, the hospital visits, the way he counted tip money twice because English wasn't his first language and he was terrified of making mistakes. After he was fired, he had left the phone behind in his locker. Everyone assumed it was broken. Grace had kept it. "Why?" Elias asked. "Because he kept trying to tell people something before he left." She pressed a button. Voicemail appeared. Deleted. Almost deleted. Corrupted. Only part of it remained. Static crackled through the speaker. A man's voice emerged. Weak. Distorted. Didn't sign it. Wasn't me. More static. Blue folder. Check the message ended abruptly. Elias listened again. Then again. Most people would have dismissed it. Too damaged. Too incomplete. Grace didn't. Miguel left that voicemail the day before he was fired. And nobody listened to it? Nobody wanted to. Her answer landed harder than she intended. Elias looked at the phone without touching it. Then his gaze shifted toward the office upstairs. Something in his expression changed. Not belief. Not certainty. Recognition. You said the signature wasn't his. Grace nodded. I helped him fill out forms after the accident. You remember his handwriting? I remember everything people think doesn't matter. For a moment neither spoke. Then footsteps sounded from the staircase. Ray Mercer descended carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. His smile appeared immediately when he saw them together. Still here? He asked. Dedicated employees are hard to find. His eyes flicked to the old phone. Only for an instant. But the smile tightened. Grace saw it. Elias saw it too. What's that? Ray asked. Miguel's old phone, Grace replied. Interesting. He laughed softly. Poor guy. He had a rough time after leaving. The wording felt careful. Rehearsed. You still keep things from former employees? Grace held his gaze. Some things shouldn't disappear. Pause followed. Tiny. Sharp. Ray opened the portfolio and produced a disciplinary statement. Actually, this might help clear things up. He placed the document on the table. Miguel's signature sat at the bottom. Clean. Confident. Official. The explanation sounded reasonable. People often forget what they've signed, Ray said. Especially when emotions get involved. Elias studied the page. Then he studied the voicemail phone. Then the signature again. The room grew very quiet. Too quiet. Because suddenly he remembered something from years ago. A trusted accountant. Perfect records. Perfect explanations. Perfect signatures. Until one missing page. Exposed everything. Ray's document looked flawless. That was the problem. Miguel barely wrote English. Yet the signature on the statement flowed across the page with the effortless confidence of someone who practiced it every day. And for the first time, Elias found himself wondering whether the man he had been casually trusting every time he walked into this diner was lying about far more than a receipt. Ray never saw the change happen. That was the dangerous part. Elias Moretti did not become louder. He became quieter. The next morning rain tapped softly against the diner windows while customers drifted in and out beneath gray skies. A television above the counter muttered weather forecasts no one was listening to. Behind the kitchen doors, the dishwasher rattled through another cycle. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Grace stood at the coffee station filling sugar caddies when her phone vibrated once inside her apron. A bank alert. Her stomach tightened. For one awful second she thought another medical bill had hit her account. Instead it was a reminder from the hospital payment plan she had been fighting for nearly 2 years. Minimum balance due in 4 days. She slipped the phone away before anyone could see. Money was always waiting somewhere behind her shoulder. That was exactly why people like Ray thought people like her would eventually stay quiet. Later, Elias sat alone in his usual booth while a man in a dark suit joined him for less than 10 minutes. No introductions. No raised voices. The man accepted a folder and left through the side entrance. Grace noticed because she noticed everything. She noticed the folder contained copies, not originals. She noticed Elias never touched his coffee. She noticed his eyes drifted toward the office upstairs twice in under a minute. Something was moving beneath the surface now. Something careful. That afternoon Elias made 3 requests. He asked for archived payroll records. He requested freezer maintenance logs from the past 12 months. And he quietly instructed his attorney to obtain vendor contracts connected to the delivery company listed on the suspicious receipts. No accusations. No confrontation. Just paper. Numbers. Signatures. Facts. By evening the first pieces began connecting. The delivery company listed on the receipts existed. But only on paper. The address led to an empty warehouse 40 miles outside the city. The phone number routed to a disconnected line. More troubling was the payment history. Every invoice had been approved by the same manager. Every adjustment occurred during overnight shifts. Every discrepancy landed on employees least likely to challenge it.
Immigrants.
Single parents. Older workers. People carrying debt. People carrying fear. The rain intensified outside. Grace was cleaning table 14 when Elias approached. "Why didn't you report this?" he asked. She knew immediately what he meant. To who? Her answer came without hesitation. Elias said nothing. "People think money is why someone stays quiet," Grace continued softly. "Most of the time it's because they're tired." She wiped the table with slow circles. Miguel wanted his name cleared. "My mom wants her medication. I just want the truth written down somewhere before someone changes it again." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Not pity, not admiration, something else. Understanding, perhaps. Then he nodded once and walked away. That night another file arrived from his attorney. Personnel records. Hundreds of pages. Elias reviewed them alone in the back office of one of his companies while city lights reflected across the glass behind him. Near midnight he found it. Not a missing signature. Not a forged form. Pattern. 6 employees terminated over 3 years. Every one of them had questioned payroll discrepancies before being fired. Every case had been documented by Ray Mercer. Every investigation had been approved by the same regional supervisor. A man Elias had known for 8 years. A man he trusted. A man whose signature appeared beside every termination report. Elias leaned back slowly. The room felt colder than before. His gaze settled on the stack of files spread across the desk. Then on Miguel's forged statement. Then on Grace's handwritten notes. For the first time, he realized he had spent months seeing Ray as competent, years trusting the supervisor who protected him, and all that time the only person actually telling the truth had been the waitress everyone kept interrupting. The trap began with a question so small nobody noticed it at first. Rain streaked down the diner windows the following evening while customers drifted through the dinner rush. Plates moved. Coffee poured. The neon sign hummed against the dark. Everything looked normal. That was the point. Grace stood at the service station rolling silverware when Elias entered and took his usual booth.
No entourage. No announcement.
Just a man ordering black coffee. Across the room, Ray relaxed almost visibly. Whatever concern had been growing behind his eyes during the past few days seemed to ease. He still believed he controlled the room. 20 minutes later, Elias called him over. "Need a favor?" Ray smiled immediately. "Of course." Elias slid a vendor receipt across the table. "One of the old ones. My accountant says this delivery arrived at 11:43. Ray barely glanced at it. "That's correct. You remember? I keep good records." Elias nodded once. Nothing more. The conversation ended there. Or appeared to. Behind the counter, Grace felt her pulse quicken. She knew that receipt. It was the one tied to the first discrepancy. The one Ray should have needed paperwork to verify. Not memory. An hour later, another piece moved into place. Grace carried a tray into the upstairs dining room where a regional supervisor had arrived unexpectedly. The same supervisor whose signature appeared on the termination files. The man laughed too loudly, shook hands too quickly, complimented Ray 3 times in 10 minutes. Grace set down water glasses and stepped away. Nobody paid attention to her. That was often when she saw the most. The supervisor reached for a folder on the table. As he did, a key card slipped halfway out of his jacket pocket. Gray plastic. Diner property. Grace froze. The card wasn't assigned to managers. It belonged to maintenance staff. She had seen the color hundreds of times. The supervisor noticed her looking and shoved it back into his pocket. Too fast. Much too fast. Downstairs, Elias remained quiet. Watching. Waiting. Near closing time, he asked one final question. "Who handled freezer maintenance 3 weeks ago?" Ray answered immediately. "Outside contractor." The supervisor nodded. That's right. Elias stirred his untouched coffee. Interesting. Silence followed. Neither man liked silence. That much Grace had begun to learn. Honest people often filled silence with truth. Liars filled it with explanations. The supervisor cleared his throat first. There may have been some confusion in the records. Ray jumped in before the sentence finished. Paperwork always gets messy. There it was. The same thing. The same instinct. Two men rushing toward the answer before the question fully arrived. Grace looked down at the tray in her hands. Then she remembered something. A detail so small nobody else would have cared. 3 weeks ago, during the supposed freezer repair, she had worked the closing shift. She remembered because her mother had called from the pharmacy. She remembered because she spilled soup on her apron. Most of all, she remembered because maintenance workers always wore bright orange safety tags on their belts. That night, nobody had. Not one person. Before she could second-guess herself, she quietly placed a photocopy on Elias's table. A still image from old security footage she had saved months earlier. Grainy. Black and white. Easy to ignore. Except for one detail. The man entering through the back door at 11:43 wasn't wearing a contractor uniform. He was wearing the regional supervisor's suit. For the first time, Ray stopped smiling. And for the first time, he looked from Grace to Elias and realized the waitress was no longer standing alone. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The photocopied security image lay on the table between them like something alive. Rain tapped softly against the upstairs dining room windows. Crystal water glasses caught the yellow light. Somewhere downstairs, a coffee mug shattered, followed by distant laughter from customers who had no idea what was happening above them. Ray looked at the image, then at the regional supervisor, then back at the image. A still frame doesn't prove anything, he said carefully. His voice remained steady. Almost. People can be mistaken. Grace reached into her apron pocket before anyone could answer. The motion was small. Familiar. The same pocket where she had carried receipts, notes, schedules, and every overlooked detail nobody else bothered to keep. She placed her old phone on the table. You're right, she said quietly. One picture doesn't prove it. The room became very still. Elias watched her without interruption. Grace opened a file buried deep inside the phone's storage. Not photos. Video. A backup she had saved months earlier because the diner cameras automatically deleted footage after 30 days. Most employees never knew that. Grace had learned it accidentally while helping reset a register. The screen flickered. Grainy black and white footage appeared. Timestamp. 11:41 p.m. The back hallway. The freezer corridor. The loading entrance. The regional supervisor entered first. Ray appeared 30 seconds later. Neither man carried tools. Neither man wore maintenance badges. At 11:43, the supervisor handed Ray a folder. At 11:44, Ray opened the freezer access panel beside the corridor. At 11:46, both men disappeared from camera view. Nobody spoke while the footage played. The silence tightened around the room like wire. When the clip ended, Grace opened a second file. This was deleted from the main system, she said, but not from the backup. The supervisor's face had lost color. Ray tried to smile. The effort failed. You don't know what you're looking at. Then explain it, Elias said. His voice was calm. That made it worse. Ray swallowed. Inventory review. At midnight, Elias asked. No answer. Grace slid one final document across the table. The altered shift log. The one Ray had changed. Beside it she placed the original copy she had photographed weeks earlier. Same page. Same date. Different times. Different ink. Different handwriting pressure. The differences were obvious now. Impossible to ignore. You changed my shift after it happened, Grace said. Her voice trembled slightly. Not from fear. From exhaustion. You moved me away from the loading dock, so it looked like I couldn't have seen anything. The supervisor stood abruptly. His chair scraped across. Hardwood. This is ridiculous. Nobody looked at him. That was when he realized he had lost the room. Elias lowered his gaze to the documents, then to the footage, then to the termination reports, then to Miguel's voicemail transcript resting beside them. Piece after piece. Receipt, schedule, payroll, security backup, termination files. Every small thing the waitress had preserved because nobody else thought it mattered. And suddenly something far more painful than fraud settled over him. He remembered every time he had walked into this diner and nodded politely at Grace before looking past her. Every time he had trusted reports because they came from men with titles. Every time he had mistaken confidence for honesty and quiet observation for insignificance. The realization struck harder than the evidence itself. Grace had been telling the truth for months. The people under his authority had been punished for it. And his name had protected the men responsible. No one spoke. Not even Ray. Not even the supervisor. Elias stared at the footage one last time before removing his glasses and setting them carefully on the table. Then he looked toward the doorway where his attorney had quietly entered without anyone noticing. "Call my attorney," he said. "Nobody leaves this room. Nobody left the room. Not that night. Not when the attorney arrived. Not when the company auditors appeared with sealed folders. Not when the regional supervisor finally stopped pretending the evidence could be explained away. The truth did not explode. Settled. Heavy.
Permanent.
Like concrete hardening around a foundation that had been cracked for years. Ray Mercer was suspended before sunrise. By the end of the week, he was terminated. The investigation uncovered altered payroll records, falsified disciplinary reports, manipulated schedules, and missing tip distributions stretching back nearly 3 years. The regional supervisor resigned before formal proceedings began. It didn't help. Lawsuits followed. Financial records were seized. Employees received letters. For the first time, the people who had been told they were confused, careless, emotional, difficult, or dishonest were officially informed that they had been right. The diner felt different afterward. Not immediately. Places carried memories longer than people did. The upstairs dining room still held echoes of polite humiliation. The office still smelled faintly of Ray's cologne. But change arrived in small ways. Missing wages were repaid. Personnel files were corrected. Miguel Santos received a formal letter clearing his record. When he returned to collect it, he stood in the parking lot for nearly 10 minutes before walking inside. Grace watched him read the document twice. Then he quietly thanked her. Nothing more. Somehow that meant more than applause ever could. 2 weeks later, Elias called a staff meeting before opening hours. The entire diner gathered beneath the fluorescent lights. Cooks, servers, dishwashers, night shift workers, people who had spent years lowering their voices when managers walked past. No one knew exactly why they had been called in. Grace stood near the back, wishing she could disappear into the coffee station. Old habits lingered. Elias stepped forward holding a thin folder. "There are corrections that should have happened a long time ago," he said. His voice was calm. The room listened. "Every employee affected by falsified payroll records will be compensated in full." A murmur moved through the crowd. "Medical reimbursement assistance will be established for staff and immediate family." Grace froze. "And all future payroll reviews will be conducted independently." No applause followed. Not yet. People were still trying to believe it. Then Elias opened the folder and removed a single page. One more correction. Silence settled across the room. "Grace Holloway's personnel record has been amended." She felt every eye turn toward her. Instinct told her to look down. She didn't. "The complaints filed against her have been removed." Elias glanced at the page once before continuing. The disciplinary concerns attached to her employment file were determined to be false. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. The record now reflects what should have been written from the beginning. He closed the folder. Employee responsible for identifying payroll fraud and preserving evidence. The silence afterward felt different from every other silence she had known in that building. Not judgment. Not embarrassment. Respect. Real respect. Later that afternoon, Grace sat beside her mother during a follow-up medical appointment that no longer carried the same fear. Payment arrangements had been secured. Insurance issues had been resolved. Nobody was threatening collections. Nobody was holding illness over their heads. Her mother squeezed her hand and smiled without saying a word. Back at the diner, a small frame appeared behind the counter a few days later. Inside it rested an old cracked name tag. The same one Grace had carried in her pocket. The same one she had once hidden because she hated people looking at it. Beneath the frame sat a simple brass plaque. Not manager, not supervisor, not hero, just her name, correctly spelled. Grace Holloway. One evening after closing, she stood alone beneath the warm glow of the counter lights, staring at it while fresh coffee cooled beside her. Elias approached quietly. Neither spoke for a moment. Finally he asked, "Do you know what surprised me most?" Grace shook her head. He looked at the framed name tag. "How many people saw you every day and never really looked at you?" Grace considered that. Then she smiled softly and wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. At least somebody finally did. Elias didn't answer. He simply stood there in the quiet diner while the neon sign hummed against the night, and for the first time in a very long time, the truth mattered more than the people who had tried to bury it, and the woman they had spent years overlooking was finally the one being heard.